När ett barn blir allvarligt sjukt behöver du hantera en ny vardag. Men det finns stöd att få. Ronald McDonald Hus ger familjer möjligheten att bo tillsammans medan barnet vårdas på sjukhus. Vill du ge fler familjer samma möjlighet? Swisha till 970 22.
Today's guest is Eric Kaufman, who is a professor of political science at Birkbeck College at London University. He has written several books, of which White Shift, Populism, Immigration and the Future of White Majorities, which came out in 2018, is one of the more interesting books that have come out in recent years. It is about the demographic change of the Western world, about the reactions this gave rise to, about right-wing populism and its opposite, left-wing modernism. The last time Eric was on this podcast in June 2021, we focused our discussion on this subject. Today we talk more about the threats to academic freedom and what can be done about it. And this is something Eric has been working on a lot lately, and he's been vocal in defense of the new freedom of speech bill, which the Tory government in Britain proposed recently. His argument is that conservatives, or people on the right, need to be more active in combating the left's institutional takeover that is happening at basically all major institutions. It was a delight to talk to Eric, and the podcast could have been much longer, but do you like what he says? Then give him a follow on Twitter or check him out at sneps.net, which is SNEPS.net, where all his public talks and writings are collected. Now on to today's guest. You're listening to Rak Höger with me, Ivar Arpi. Welcome, Eric Kaufman, to Rak Höger.
Ivar, thanks for having me.
Having you back, actually, because you were one of my first guests on this podcast, I think. Now it's almost 2 years ago, or 1.5 years ago, I think.
Well, I'm honored to be one of the chosen few, I guess.
Yeah, you really are. I rarely have guests back. So, but the last time you were on, we spoke about your book White Shift and changing demographies of the Western world, and that subject was really. It was really something that was being debated to a large degree in Sweden back then. It still is, sort of, but the debates the specific debates have died down. What I particularly like about your book is that you managed to write about a very controversial subject in a way that doesn't, I think this at least, that it doesn't inflame or polarize more. And you also present data and different, like how you can probabilities for which future we will head to, and such. So it's a constructive book, but I received a lot of criticism for having you on the show, and I still do. It's one of the you always, after a while, when you've been in the public sphere, you gather. People think that they have certain points that they can pinpoint you on, and then they're like a tweet you wrote 3 years ago, and it always comes up.
Right.
And, the podcast I made with you is a point that always comes up. Look at this. He had a peddler in the conspiracy theory of replacement theory on his podcasts, and that's a recurring criticism. So I just wanted you to. And not fight my battles, but maybe is this like are you that controversial? Because I didn't think so when I had you on, and I didn't think you said anything particularly controversial, really.
No, I mean, I've written about the whole idea of the Great Replacement. I did a piece in Unheard, and it's one of these ones where and so you have all of these subtleties, right? So if by Great Replacement you mean this idea of a conspiracy of leftists or the World Economic Forum or somebody to deliberately change the ethnic composition of Western countries. I mean, I think that's ridiculous nonsense. But then what you have is, of course, the reality of ethnic change, for example, which is as much of a left-wing trope as a right-wing trope, So I talk about this in the paper. Michael Moore saying the drop in the white population is the greatest day in American history. I mean, so you have all of this going on. You have the ethnic change. Now, my view is it's very much it arises almost as it comes out of decisions taken by often progressive governments, not always. Their motivations, however, are not actually to change the ethnic composition. Usually it's about they want to look like they're being nice and moral. And so as a result, they open things up, and that accelerates the change, and that leads to, now you can call this term replacement is another one. Demographers and use it all the time. So yeah, I know I have addressed that. Am I very controversial? I don't know. I mean, I'm certainly giving talks at all of the major universities, Oxford's and places, Cornell and all these sorts of places, University of Southern California. I'm just trying to sort of think of the ones I've done in the last 6 months or so.
I follow you. One can I recommend following you on Podcaster. I do. And then you can catch up on at least an assortment of your speeches and conferences when they are recorded.
They're all on my website as well. Snaps.net, SNEPS.net.
But the replacement theories, I've been accused of like being a proponent of it, and of course. You could say that I am in a very limited sense, in that there is a change, a major demographic change, and there are consequences. And you can what you do in your book to a much deeper degree than I have done in my articles is that you show how and at what pace, and also what arguments are being given at different times. So I mean, in that regard, if that is in that narrow sense, if that's what you mean by it, but oftentimes it's as you say, oftentimes you mean like there's a dark like an esoteric group who plan this and want this, and they orchestrate it all. It can be the Bilderberg group, or it can be the World Economic Forum, it can be George Soros. Oftentimes, it's also a question of a Jewish conspiracy. Not always, but it's almost always, and all that I don't believe in. And one of the reasons why I don't believe it is that it's very hard to even plan going on a hike with friends. Like we are 4 friends and we often go hiking together, and it's a nightmare just to plan and just to get people to bring like a sleeping bag. And if 4 people, we are basically, of course, we are idiots because we can't plan a hiking trip together. But I mean, we're not more of an idiot. I'm not more of an idiot than the next man. So the level of competence that would be required to orchestrate this on a global scale and do it simultaneously, it's just not part of human nature. It's just not possible. It's impossible for that reason as well. I would say. Yeah.
But I think it is interesting that, left-wing commentators can use terms like the browning of America, the transformation of America, all these sorts of terms, and celebrate it and never be accused of talking about great replacement. So, okay, that's fair enough. I mean, if you want to limit it to conspiracy theories, that's fine. But yet, if someone who's critical of the pace of immigration raises the exact same points, they're accused of being great replacement. I think it's just intellectually dishonest, really.
Yeah. And you can see in many of the leading politicians in the Democratic Party, as you say, they've been like celebrating the change. And we've been doing it in Sweden as well. Like we celebrate the increasing diversity, and it's wonderful. And then if somebody says, I see the same thing, but I see it's not as benign in every respect, then it's awful. And I did like one of the most celebrated texts 2 years ago, I think, or 1 year ago, when an author and cultural writer, Jens Liljestrand, he wrote that he drove cabs on a book tour all over Sweden, and everyone who drove him was foreign-born, and the cities he came to in the city centers, foreign-born were sitting and dominating the city squares. And he said that we Swedes are guests here in this part of the country, and it's wonderful that it's living again because of these people. And then I wrote something similar, but I said that this explains why people are voting for the Sweden Democrats to a larger degree, because they are critical of this change. It's going too rapidly. And I of course, was very heavily criticized by Jens Liljestrand, for example.
Right. So you had the wrong attitude, same set of facts, but the wrong attitude. That's basically all it means. And then so they expand the definition of racism to try and shut you down. And that's what I object to, is this stretching of this concept. They'll narrow it when they're talking about it, then stretch it out for you when you're talking about exactly the same phenomenon. Yeah,
and I was hoping we could segue into another discussion that I know you are something you're working with or on, and that's the freedom of speech bill that has been presented in Britain, where you're based, and it has to do with academic freedom, and it's something we have a new government in Sweden, so it's also something that pertains to us, is how Britain handles this, because our new minister who's in charge of this is doing an investigation right now. He's starting it to see how deep the problem goes in the Swedish academia. So could you just paint a picture of why this bill was proposed, and if it's a good bill, and describe the problem with academic freedom in Britain now?
Yeah, I think Britain is sort of representing it's a country where there is this problem, but of course this is a problem that you see across the West, and particularly the English-speaking West, but also I think Northern Europe. So just to give you some, I could pull out anecdotes like people who've been canceled, like Kathleen Stock, who got hounded out of her position at University of Sussex, or Noah Carl, who got fired from a Cambridge fellowship. But rather than going through these anecdotes, what I've done is I've done a series of surveys. So I did a report for the think tank called Policy Exchange, which is the main right-of-center think tank in Britain on academic freedom. In the UK, we had a survey from YouGov, and YouGov has a panel of 500,000 in the United Kingdom, of which there are about 1,000 academics who happen. These are people who take surveys for YouGov, which is a very large survey firm. So these are 1,000 people who just happen to be on the YouGov platform. We got about 3/4 of them in our sample. So these are academics or retired academics, and so we were able to survey a relatively accidental sample that is not handpicked, not self-selected. Now, what did we find? A number of things. So, for example, the left-right split in the social sciences and humanities, it's about 9 on the left for every 1 on the right in terms of active academic teaching staff. That 1 out of 10 on the right, about something like 7 out of 10 said their departments were hostile climates for their political beliefs. 5 out of 10 said they self-censored in teaching, research, and academic discussion. Now, in the US, those numbers are slightly higher, so it's about 7 out of 10. In Canada, it's about 7 out of 10 in survey work I've done, who are self-censoring. So it's this massive self-censoring that's going on amongst people who don't have the orthodox political views of the majority of faculty members. So that was a lot of the focus was on academic faculty and how they are essentially restricting their speech in many ways. Now, we also asked about, have you been punished by your institution or your department for things you've taught, written, etc.? And that was less. I mean, it was sort of more like something on the order of 1 in 10 academics, a little bit higher for those on the right, it's about 1 in 5. So we've got a certain level of punishment, but the biggest thing is, the biggest thing, of course, is people self-censoring. Now, one of the reasons for that is you've also got a lot of political discrimination. 1 in 3 British academics would not hire a known supporter of the Leave side in the Brexit referendum. And so that, again, is an example of where, because of this discrimination, if you have any sense, you're not going to mention that you voted Leave, even if you did, because then your chance of getting hired, promoted, getting published is going to be a lot lower. So you have this climate of repression, and that's partly a result of political prejudice on the part of progressives. And then you have, now, when it comes to cancel culture, on the one hand, some good news, it's only 1 in 10 British academics would support firing a controversial professor who's reporting controversial findings on race, gender, and sexuality. But about 40% aren't sure if they would oppose or support plan to fire. So they're on the fence. And that's a very important group. They don't support cancel culture, but they don't really oppose it either. And so this is kind of one of the big problems. Another problem we have is majority of academics will support policies like mandatory diversity statements for applying for a job, right? Which says, how are you going to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion? And they think there's nothing wrong with forcing people to have one of these statements as a condition of being able to apply for a job or a grant. 60% of academics in the UK, Australia, the US, mainly social sciences, would support these. Now,
in Sweden, we have basically all funding for research goes through the 4 governmental agencies who are funding different areas, mainly different areas. There are some overlap, and they are they have like specific questions which pertains to this, like how are you going to apply a gender perspective in your research?
Right.
And then they added, if applicable, but everybody gets the memo, like you should have this perspective. And also in the composition of the research body, like the research applying for it, the research group, they must have, like, if they don't have the right mix of gender, or if they don't have diversity, they have to account for why that is in that case, and they get a lower score. So sometimes you have, I've spoken to a lot of academics when I wrote my last book, and what they do, some of them, is that they go to like a colleague, a woman, and oftentimes, and they say, like, could you just be a part of this project? And sometimes the woman knows, like, okay, so I'm being just an apron. I'm just being a stooge for this. And some of them are fine with it, and others are not. Like they know that some of them think, like, hey, hate the game, not the player. Right. So we have everybody has to go through these hoops. Jump through these hoops.
And what's important here is that these academics, they don't, if you say, should an academic who says that diversity is bad for society, finds that and reports that, should they be fired? Very few academics will say yes, only about 1 in 10. But when you say something like, should we have a mandatory equity diversity statement for a job? By more than 2 to 1, they'll support that. 60% will support that. Now, it's interesting. So I've also asked, should there be quotas for race and gender on reading lists? This is what's called the decolonization of reading lists, which is a very political term. And again, you'll get about 45% support against 33% opposition. And so they're supporting things that sound good because they seem nice and they seem like they're helping the downtrodden. I mean, that is really the motivation that's going on here. Now, what's interesting is you then say, okay, let's say somebody refuses to change their reading list because on free speech grounds. What should be the punishment? Because this is something they don't think about. They only think about the nice, bright, we're helping the poor downtrodden. Yeah. They don't think about, now we have to punish people who don't comply, right? Yeah. So when you get them to think about it and you say, should this person be fired? Very few, or taken off the course. So most of them will step back from harsh punishments for not going along with this agenda, right? But most of them will still support certain kinds of social pressure, make them go take diversity training, things which are actually quite authoritarian. So even though they are not personally, they don't think of themselves as authoritarians, they support policies whose underbelly is very authoritarian, and they're willing to look the other way. And I think that's a lot of what occurs in the system, is you have academics who believe they are liberals, but are tacitly endorsing illiberal policies.
Well, but what's interesting is I find if you ask one pointedly, would you support firing of someone who's just using their academic freedom, then the liberalism activates. But if you ask the question in other ways, you could get them to go along with a lot of things, because it doesn't activate. If I want to use Jonathan Haidt's, the 6 dimensions of moral.
Yes, moral foundations.
Moral foundations. Yes. Then you have the oppression, freedom, one of them, and you it's like that when that is activated, then most will support academic freedom. But when it's just care, harm, or something like that, then that trumps the liberty dimension altogether.
Yeah, that's a really good point, is that when you make the care harm salient, they always go for that over, or not always, but a majority will. I mean, a good question is, do you support political correctness because it protects disadvantaged groups, or do you oppose it because it stifles free speech? In our survey for UK social science humanities academics, 75% support political correctness, 20% oppose under that definition. Whereas in the general public, it's 47% opposed versus 37% in favor. So it just shows that compared to the general public, the academics are far, far more likely to prioritize care harm over free speech.
Yeah. And one of the criticisms towards, we'll get to the bill as well, but one of the criticisms when you bring up cancel culture, we had our new Minister of Education, as I mentioned, he's part of the Liberal Party in the right-wing coalition, that right of center coalition that is formed the government now in Sweden, and his name is Mats Persson, and was a big documentary with a series of cases from Swedish academia, which had been publicized before by me, for example. But when it comes on the big screen and it's a documentary, it catches the eye of more people, of course. And so he said that we will look into it. We will have an investigation of the cancel culture in Sweden. And then people said, but how many people does this really pertain to? I mean, because there are a few very publicized cases, but they are not very many. And then you say, like, okay, so this is a very peripheral problem. And that's been one of the criticisms towards I've seen the criticism targeted your way when you've been in the British debate. So how does one respond to that these are, as you said, these are just anecdotes?
Right. So there's a couple of things. I mean, one is you can track the frequency of these incidents, which has risen dramatically since the first decade of the 2000s, whether that be no platformings, whether that be targeting of professors. So even though the total number as a percentage of total academic staff or students is very small, the number has gone up. Now, so the question then becomes, well, each one of these incidents has a ripple effect. So this is perhaps the most important factor, is the chilling effect of any particular incident is enormous. And we've now got data, and this isn't released, but I may as well, I can drop you one particular data point. We have now asked U.S. academics if they are fearful of losing their job or their job or reputation for things they may say or online posts being misinterpreted. And among conservative inclined academics, this is a very large majority who are fearful of this happening to them. They're worried, at least to some degree. So we have a sort of four response category: very worried, quite worried, not very worried, not at all worried. So those who are in the top two are, it's 7 out of 10 on the right. So we're talking about a massive chill that is being experienced by academics. Now, among students, there's also a significant chill. So if you take the chilling effect of these things, depending on the size of your system, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of academics in the United States. We're talking about millions of students. Now, in a smaller population, whatever that number is, but it is probably a majority of anyone who leans conservative. So I guess what I would say is the big problem is that. And what that means is people are not saying certain things, not researching certain things, not giving their opinion in discussion. It's distorting the entire truth-seeking mission of the university, as well as suppressing people's freedoms, academic freedom. So that would be my response initially to those who try and minimize these effects. Now, of course, it is also true that a lot of this is not coming from institutions, but it is coming from political prejudice from peers who are threatening you on social media. And that's another part of this discussion. So there's kind of the top-down, what I call the vertical institutional punishment, and then the peer-to-peer horizontal political discrimination.
I think this is I'm not sure if it is, but it might be a difference between the Anglo-Saxon countries and Sweden here, because what I find is many of the institutions are enacting government because the universities in Sweden are not independent. They are government agencies. So they are enacting politics. And so if the government says you have to recruit, you have to have recruit 40% women as professors until 2040, for example, then they have to do that, and they have to enact how the recruitment policies, and they have to change that. There are a few institutions that are independent in Sweden, but there is what I've found when you look at them, they are even worse when it comes to identity policy. Right. They could have gone the other way, but it seems like they are doing more. And it's the same with when you have like if you say something as a teacher and you get a complaint, and then you get investigated, and you might get fired or get warned or something like that, ostracized in some way, or you lose the course, you cannot teach on that course anymore.
Right.
So that is something that is what I find is people are afraid that something like that might happen. And actually in Sweden we have, if one student is complaining and says that I've been violated because of my race, gender identity, sex, sexual orientation or something like that, the university has an obligation to investigate it and make a formal investigation. So you come to this situation. Some of these are not publicized, of course, but like teachers are sitting with one of these people who are political commissar, a member of the political commissariat there are in each and every university now, that has to do with implementing discrimination laws, gender mainstreaming, and these are, then you have to, they are basically the people who are leading these investigations, and they are also the people who are have the power over you as an academic in the end. Sometimes.
Well, that sounds. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting the way it sounds like Sweden operates. I think there's a positive and a negative there. I mean, the negative clearly is the universities have been politicized, overtly politicized. I think the positive sounds, however, that if you get a conservative government, let's say, they should have the levers to reverse all of that very quickly if they have the political stomach. Now, I don't know what the legislative framework is around equality law in Sweden, because one of the problems in the US to some degree is some of the provisions of the civil rights law that's developed since 1965 or in Britain since 2010, the Equalities Act, is unclear about some of these terms like hostile environment and bullying. And so if you say a woman is an adult human female as an academic, Does that mean that somebody who's taking your class might feel unsafe and who's trans, and therefore you have violated the spirit of the law? It's vague. It's too vague right now. Now, what you need is the government to essentially issue guidance that clarifies that actually freedom of speech takes precedence over this, and this is the threshold. That is the kind of thing governments need to do. I'd say in the Swedish case, you would need also the government to be very proactive in saying, we're going to sort of roll back this DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. We're going to define it this way and not that way. But you would need the political will to do that.
Well, I mean, one of the best ways, I would say, as a politician, but maybe also as a parent or a manipulative partner, abusive partner, is to say that you are for freedom while you're actually against it. So you say overtly that I'm just doing this to be nice, but you're not being nice. Or I'm doing this to protect academic freedom, but you're actually not doing it to protect. So you use these positive code words and you do something else, and then it's harder to criticize you, because then it sounds like you are the one criticizing academic freedom. So what I find here when you speak about academic freedom in Sweden, oftentimes you are the one being criticized as wanting to be like Viktor Orban is a famous word that always comes up. Urbanization. Like, this is the first shot being fired in an urbanization of Sweden. If you're saying that you don't want all researchers to have to show that how they apply a gender perspective, even if it's physics, then you are going in the direction of Orban. And I always say that I'm protecting. I'm for the academic freedom in Hungary. So the university he closed down. I want that to be. That was wrong, and I don't want anything to be forbidden. But is that the case in Britain as well? That have you been criticized that you are actually not protecting academic freedom, you're doing something else entirely?
Well, yeah. I mean, this is sort of one of the classic arguments, right? Is to say that if you are in favor of government reforming or intervening in these institutions, compromising their autonomy, then you are an Orban type and you are going against liberalism. And the problem with that argument is that society is really three layers and not two. And this is one of these things that shouldn't need explaining, but it does. So you've got government, institutions, and individuals. So there's two forms of censorship. You can have the government, like in China, telling you what you can't say. We've had that form through much of human history, government censorship. But you can also have what's called private censorship, which is the middle layer. The institutions are what is suppressing your free speech. And in a recent paper, Jonathan Turley at George Washington University, he says that private censorship is now actually a considerably greater threat than government censorship to free speech in Western countries like the US. And so the question becomes, what do you do about private censorship? And certainly in institutions that are controlled and funded by government can be the protector of the individuals from the institutions. So government actually can protect human freedom by preventing institutions from censoring people. And that is really what this bill, the Higher Education Freedom Bill in Britain, is about. It's about preventing universities from suppressing free speech of individuals. And so that, in that sense, it's protecting individuals. Now, this is all in keeping with the law. In fact, the law is being violated by universities. So this is essentially about enforcing the law as it exists, people's rights as they exist. Now, that's a big difference, say, from the Orban case, where it might be that he has violated, and he's openly said that he talks about illiberalism, so he's clearly not a liberal. No. But this idea of violating individual rights, this is not what these bills do. These bills are actually protecting individual rights. It's just that they're protecting them against an institutional or administrative actor. So, yeah, it's a bit of sort of sleight of hand. I mean, it's a bit like saying, if a gang comes to my door and won't let me leave my house, the only way I get my freedom back is if the gang is arrested by the police. So that involves, yes, the government is protecting my freedom. Or equally, if we think about a corrupt, you can have a corrupt institution, a corrupt police department that the government has to take into special measures, a corrupt school that's taken over by religious fundamentalists, which has happened in Britain, and that has to be taken into special measures. An example might be and you've seen this before in history, like the University of Mississippi didn't admit any black students. The government had to step in to protect the equal rights of black. So there's a lot of instances, and so it's very much a red herring, I think, to say this is illiberal urbanism.
One of the criticisms that often comes up is, what is the freedom for? Why? Who are the people that are going to be protected under this bill? Is it Holocaust deniers? I saw a criticism of the bill and of specifically of you and of Matthew Goodwin, which I recently had on the podcast as well, and one of the criticisms was that this is not a freedom of speech bill at all. It's a hate speech bill, because what will be allowed is, and it was a parliamentarian from the Labour Party, I should say, Matt Western, who wrote this.
Det är festivalsäsong och det betyder massor av lera. Så Alex surfade in på Amazon för att hitta ett tält som rymmer upp till 5 torra vänner, en mysig campingsäng, skön, och leopardmönstrade gummistövlar. Miau! Nu får Alex hantera precis lagom mycket lera för att vara Alex, vilket är betydligt mindre lera än för den där leriga dansande mannen där borta. Men vänta, har han bara lera på sig? Japp, bara lera. Håll dig torr, får det att hända. Hitta det på amazon.se.
Upptäck Ford e-Custom, elversionen av Europas mest sålda transportbil. Den har upp till 370 kilometers räckvidd, snabbladdning och finns nu med 4-hjulsdrift. Just nu till Ford Pro Edition-pris från 479 000 ex-moms. Läs mer på Ford.se eller besök din Ford återförsäljare. Ready, set, Ford.
Tänk om din plånbok kunde prata. Vad skulle den då säga om din relation till ekonomi?
Alla relationer har ju sina ups and downs. Men att han har lån lite här och där, det tror jag skulle vara en ick för rätt många plånböcker och inte bara för mig.
Ett första steg mot en bättre relation till sin plånbok kan vara att samla sina lån.
Samla dina lån till ett på lendo.se.
And so he said that the speech that will be protected is something that will hurt the freedom of minorities, of women, of vulnerable groups. So it will actually decrease the academic freedom if you protect academic freedom.
Yeah. I mean, I find this to be one of the most common arguments that the left, when they engage, that they make. And actually, I think it's it has a lot of authoritarian overtones, in the sense that, if you say something that offends somebody, that somehow you are impinging on their freedom. So they're confusing freedom to speak, let's say, with some sort of notion of feeling good about yourself, therefore you feel empowered to speak. And actually these things are different. And so they have this concept of equal speech. And then there's been some interesting work by an academic called Teresa Bejan, Bejan, on this, that their argument is a kind of equal speech argument, that we have to give equal power and self-esteem to everybody in order to release their inner freedom. And therefore, by muzzling people who have too much speech power, we empower free speech. And it's all that is a kind of Orwellian twisting of the meaning of ordinary language, which you see time and time again on the kind of cultural left, by essentially talking about a kind of redistribution of power as freedom. It's a bit like the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, right? I mean, what is the term democracy doing there? And so, I think it's a reason we can have a discussion about equality versus freedom, but don't pretend that equality is freedom. It is not. It is a different value, a different principle. So the idea that, yes, people who are confident and maybe from certain groups, they may speak up. Well, maybe men speak more than women. So if we muzzle a certain proportion of men, that somehow that makes women feel more free. Well, maybe or maybe not, but the principle there is not freedom. The principle is you're using some kind of force, usually administrative force, to suppress the speech of certain people in order to achieve some kind of notion of equality. Fine, if that's what you believe in, call it equality, call it egalitarianism. I would call it a form of cultural socialism. So similarly, in this case, when they're talking about so-called hate speech, speech, and of course the definition of that is very elastic, right? So, saying that a woman is an adult human female or defending the gender-critical feminist position, that is interpreted as hate speech towards the trans community. What that does is essentially shut down that debate, supposedly empowering trans people. And of course, there's never any science, never any evidence for any of these claims. So my only view on this is that this is a violation of freedom of speech in the name of equality. That's all it is. And so I don't go along with those arguments, no.
Many times these discussions boil down to questions of definitions and a battle over words and what they mean. And one of those is, of course, what is the legitimate field of politics? So in your science, you make a very convincing case, I would say, that there's a small group. The group of right-wing academics is much smaller than the group of left-wing academics and the conservative. But what a person from the left would say, perhaps, if you from that majority, is that no, that's not at all the case. It's just that there are fewer people now who are sexists, who are misogynists, and who are racists or colonialists in their attitudes. And if they feel that they self-censor, then that's a good thing, because that means, like, these are people that can be compared to people who are in favor of slavery after it was abolished. So if those people felt that their academic freedom if they were self-censoring, that was a good thing. And now it's a good thing that people are self-censoring if they hold these abhorrent views. That's not a sign of backwardness. That's a sign of progress.
Yes. And so what's very interesting, I think, about what you say there is the moralization of debate and politics. And so increasingly, the distance between sort of being a racist and sexist in the minds of particularly radical progressives, the distance between that and being a conservative has collapsed entirely, right? So the ease with which the term fascist will be trotted out, somebody who wants to, control the border, a fascist, right? So this collapsing of all nuance, and
you might not know that you're talking to one of the most famous fascists in Sweden right now.
Right, exactly.
A great honor for you.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, and so that's sort of partly part of what's going on. I mean, there's an interesting question that I did a survey and asked about, a question which says, people who disagree with me politically are immoral, right? Do you agree or disagree with that statement? And this is U.S. data. If you take white progressives under the age of 40, it's nearly 50% who would agree with that statement. And actually, there's other work by some political scientists at the University of Southern California, Dennis Chong and Morris Levy and Jack Citron, that's showing this, this growing intolerance amongst a younger generation on the left. I mean, the left actually, older leftists are quite a bit more tolerant than younger leftists. This is a big generational divide. And the views of those younger leftists, I think, have been shaped by the sort of Herbert Marcuse repressive tolerance, which sort of suggests that it's okay to repress the speech of so-called powerful groups, i.e. conservatives in his thinking. That has become mainstream in a way. And it sort of reflects this cognitive bias, which is called my side bias in the psychology literature. And there's been some good writing on this, that, these people earnestly believe that the other side is morally reprobate, fascistic, etc. And they don't draw any distinction between that and some of the extreme things you talked about, the racism and the sexism. So they're justifying to themselves what is effectively just political prejudice. It's as if I was generalizing about, women or Muslims or black people, and all Muslims are terrorists or something. I mean, that is sort of the way that it's the same mental process. It's just applied to a different political category. And
this is, if you look at attitudes towards marriage to other groups in the United States, I think you bring up this in White Shift as well, that you have much more tolerant views of your daughter or son marrying a person from the other race. If you're white, for example, so marrying a black person. But if you ask them in the 50s, a majority was not okay with it, but now it's the number is down to, I think, 10% or something like that. The last time I looked, at least. But if you ask the question, would you be okay if your son or daughter married a person from the other party that you vote for, so a Republican or a Democrat? Then the numbers were very low in the 50s, but now they are very high. People take objection to that. And I would say, just from experience here in Sweden, we have something similar, but it's just the Sweden Democrats really that have that. There is no, if you look at people out groups, if you and you get to label, you get to pick from a very long list of out groups, then Sweden Democrats are, I think it's a fourth of the people in Sweden hate them, and I think Muslims, that's 7%. So it's just as a point of reference. And of course, you can argue that people are answering these questionnaires and surveys in a way that they feel is tolerable. So even if you would hate Muslims, you wouldn't cross that because you shouldn't. But,
right. Well,
but it's acceptable to hate Sweden Democrats, so you can just let it out.
Right. And there's been, again, some academic research in where they've asked people to give money to different people with different characteristics. And you can see that political prejudice is much more common, far more common than race and gender prejudice. But this is, as you say, it's acceptable. And it's the same with political discrimination. So nobody would think twice about saying it's horrible that 1 in 3 British academics wouldn't hire a female academic or a black academic. That would just be abhorrent. Whereas to say I wouldn't hire a Brexit supporter, that they think that's fine. They don't understand that it's exactly the same mental process. It's exactly the difference between discriminating on the basis of religion and on the basis of philosophical belief, as embodied in political choices, is zero, actually, because, and these things have a strong, ideology. There's a strong heritable component, just as there is with other kinds of characteristics. And religion has a strong voluntary component. You can opt into a religion or not, as you can a philosophy. So, I know there was another good paper, I think, by a guy called Spencer Case on this. But so this is really where we're at. And this is one of the reasons I think we need, in addressing this, I think the key wedge is to try as much as possible to bring in philosophical and political discrimination. So if we're going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion on race and gender, we've got to talk equally about diversity, equity, and inclusion on political and philosophical beliefs. So that would mean monitoring the ideology and politics of people applying for university positions and how many get them. It would mean seeking to diversify a faculty where there are no conservatives. It would mean how is your hostile climate for people of different beliefs. It would mean, if you fire somebody on the basis of certain philosophical beliefs like gender critical feminism, that's also should be treated similarly to firing them on the basis of religious beliefs. So if we actually were to bring in that, I think that would really make the left think a lot harder. Right now, they're getting a pass. Only their categories that they care about are protected, whereas the categories that conservatives care about are unprotected. And I think one of the challenges is to try and broaden the number of categories so that it includes those that that the conservatives care about as well. I've
talked to this is a problem in if you talk broader in other organizations as well, of course. I mean, when we wrote the book that Genusdoktrinen, me and Anna-Karin Wyndham won in the Hunters Association, one of the biggest Hunters Association. They were the editor-in-chief. He wrote an editorial, and he referenced that book because then they had to do a gender critical. Like investigate the toxic masculinity and inclusion of females in the hunting teams. And I mean, they are voluntary organizations where they just like organize. It's not something that is government led. It's just people coming together and hunting. And it's one of the biggest pastimes in Sweden. We have a huge number of hunters because we're basically just a big forest. So he wrote that, and it's like, is this really what our tax subsidized money should go to, subsidizing this kind of research? And one of the biggest like forestry companies, wood companies, who owns a lot of forests in Sweden, they just called him in and said, like, you have to come in for a discussion of your values, eller värdegrund, it's called in Sweden. We always talk about that. It's basically like a value, our fundamental values.
Right.
And all organizations work with that. But he recorded it, so he upped the ante. And he asked them questions.
Right.
And they were not prepared to answer any questions because the dynamic was, of course, that they should question him. And because they were so sure of themselves that they were the good ones,
right,
and he was the bad one. But unfortunately, it ended with them kicking all of the hunters out from their forests, from that part of the organization, that organization at least, who had that paper. So it's a bigger problem. But one of the problems with including like diversity of viewpoints in this is that you have to register people, and one of the criticisms has been that it's sort of a McCarthyism that could be used to something worse. It would be worse, not better, because you would have to be so explicit all the time with your views that it would maybe increase conflicts, and it also might give recruiters more reason to not hire you, really. Is that a danger here?
I don't, because I don't think things can really get any worse than they are. And I also, a couple of things. First of all, the proposal I make is not for an affirmative action program on the basis of political beliefs. So affirmative action for conservatives. What I'm saying is you can do whatever all I'm saying is you have to have equal action. So if you want to do affirmative action on race and gender, you have to do the same on political belief. If you don't want to do anything on race and gender, you don't have to do anything on political belief. But you can't do one and not the other. I should say, by the way, that in surveys that I've done, there is bipartisan support for this. Most people think you should do as much on political belief as you do on race and gender. It's not particularly controversial, but it's not happening anywhere. The other thing I should say is that, you can monitor, just as you tick a form for race and gender, you can tick a form on how you voted or your ideology. So the firm has got data. It's not saying it can identify an individual, but it has data and it can then look at its processes. So I don't particularly see that this is and the other side will always scaremonger to prevent any change. Right? Yeah. Because they don't want this to happen. They want to be able to keep on business as usual. What I would say is that business as usual, certainly for anyone from the anti-woke side, is a disaster. So we have to start looking at radical solutions. And this this is not compelled. So you don't have to do this. But then if you aren't going to do any sort of protection on political and ideological viewpoints, then you can't do your race and gender agenda. That's all I'm saying. I should say one other thing, by the way, is that it's very interesting, the example you cited of the hunters and the forestry company. It turns out, actually my father's in the forest industry business and has done a lot of work in Sweden. And it's interesting, these people who are running the sawmills in Sweden and the worker, they're certainly not the wokest. They're not woke, really.
No.
And yet it's very interesting that they feel the need to be the enforcers of this very radical progressive ideology, right? So I think that's telling us something, that this is actually part of the everyday banal tissue, the background music of public morality. And it's gotten into the background public morality. And therefore, even these institutions like a forest products company that don't have a bunch of highly educated radical activists running them or working in them, even they feel the need to bend the knee to this ideology. And this is one of the reasons I say that actually we need to kind of focus not just on a few blue-haired activists. We actually need to sort of think much more deeply about that public morality. What is a taboo? How did we get these taboos? And starting to sort of rebalance the way those taboos operate, because they're too extreme and people are too willing to sort of bow their head to these things. They need to be a lot more critical, and there needs to be much more of a due process and a jurisprudence around how these punishments are applied and what the principles are that underpin these stigmas and taboos.
So in this bill for freedom of speech, it's proposed that there will be like an ombudsman, which is a great word because it's a Swedish word. It's a loan word from Swedish. Of course it is. It's so progressive that there will be an ombudsman. But it will be, so it's basically you're setting up, what the proposal is in Britain is that they will set up an ombudsman who will protect the academic, the individual against the institution if their academic freedom has been violated, or they like there was a sanction towards them that were unfair according to the bill, or they were fired, or some such. Is that a fair summary of the
right.
function? Yeah.
So individuals can go around their institutions and appeal to the new Academic Freedom Directorate, ombudsman on that directorate. So that's one route towards undercutting the power of the universities to suppress speech. The other route, and I've just been in some discussions on this, is this question of granting a right to sue the university for violation of your academic freedom. And now that there's a big debate over this right to sue and whether you have to first go through the process through your university, which allows the university to drag it out over a period of years and therefore neutralize this legal threat. And how to think about making it difficult for universities to do that. So there's also the right to sue, but then there is also this ombudsman on this government body. Now, of course, this is all could be seen as political in the sense that if Labour, the left-wing party, gets in, who doesn't really believe in academic freedom, if they get in, which looks likely next time, they could to some degree undo these structures or water them down in a way that Now, I think that's okay in a way if this is made public and it's in the media. People understand if you vote for the Labour government, you're going to lose your academic, we're going to have far more incidents of violations of academic freedom. That becomes part of the political debate. I mean, it's not okay, but I mean, at least I would rather have that situation. So people know this is a party that doesn't support academic freedom. So that's part of the, But so that is the idea, is that it'll give people recourse against their university rather than having to just submit to whatever their university says.
How hopeful are you that this will change something? Because sometimes you get... Well, first, I would say that Matt Goodwin, when I asked him about this, he said that he was really conflicted about it, really, because ideologically, or his own beliefs, is that the government should stay away from higher education to give it more academic freedom. The institution should be independent and should autonomous to a large degree, so that you can have your academic freedom, and the state should not sanction you in any way. But now that because of how the problem, as you stated earlier, that the limits on freedom of speech and on academic freedom and your freedom as an individual is coming from the institution, not the state, then the state must go in. So he was conflicted about that, but he had landed on that it must be done. And when I talk about this in some of these measures, perhaps in Sweden, I find that many who are on the right but have a liberal basis for their beliefs, or liberal conservatives, they are very hesitant to stand behind something that actually costs more tax money or increases the number of government agencies. Are you finding that as well, or is that is it a different picture in Britain?
No, it's the same picture, and you see that, pick that up in the survey data as well in the US and Britain. There is the older, more libertarian right, anti-government right, who don't really understand. They basically think that all censorship comes from government. Government's always the problem. I think that I hate to be cruel. I think those people are useful idiots for the sort of woke takeover of our institutions. And the sooner we can sort of reconfigure conservatism away from that kind of 1980s thinking, the better. Because the truth of the matter is, I say, well, institutional autonomy is a nice thing to have. Ideally, I want to have as much of it as possible. But individual autonomy is number one when it's clashing with institutional autonomy. So if the government can liberate individuals from institutions, then I think that it has to do so. The other thing I would say is government is working with the grain of the law. Generally, the law is being broken by institutions and not being enforced. What this bill does is it essentially gives government agencies the power to enforce existing legislation against universities that are violating that legislation. So that's the first thing I would say. Now, the other thing I think is, even more broadly, if we step away from just the problem of universities, I think we're moving to a situation now, because of the aggressive cultural left takeover of our institutions. And we could extend this to schools and hospital trusts and a whole set of institutions, including tech firms, for example, that this desire to use institutions to censor speech has been increasing. So the politicization of institutions from below by activists, the only chance the right, the conservative and classical liberal side has to defend freedom of speech is to use elected government, because every other institution is controlled by the anti-speech side. The only chance the sort of pro-speech side has is to centralize and remove power over cultural matters away from these institutions. And I know that a lot of libertarians hate that, the idea of centralization, but until they get through that mental block, all they're doing is simply handing more censorship power to the other side. So what we need actually is very, very fine-grained, clear guidance from government, elected government, which again is the only institution that the conservative side, classical liberal side can hope to control nowadays because of selective recruitment into these other institutions. They need to use government to actually reform these institutions to make them freer. And that's not a contradiction, and we've seen this in the past many times in history. But what this also means is the conservative side has to elevate these cultural issues to a higher position than progressive political parties. Progressive political parties can say, hands off, it's not our business, because all of their allies are essentially cleaning house in these institutions. It's only the right, who have no power in the institutions, that need to make this a bigger priority than the left. So when the left says you're stoking the culture war, conservative parties need to say, sorry, we're defending the values of our civilization. This is not some little tempest in a teapot going on campus. This is fundamental to who we are, and conservative parties need to do that. They're doing that in the U.S. Ron DeSantis in Florida, or Glenn Youngkin in Virginia. They are much more aware of this, and politicizing these so-called culture war issues is going to be central to pushing back on the illiberalism that we see. Now, of course, there's always a certain danger with government. The other side gets in and they do things you don't like. What I'd say is the downside risk to progressive governments coming in is relatively low, because they're already doing whatever they want. So whether they have a government in there that is friendly to them is not going to make much difference. However, it will be very important if a conservative government does academic freedom, the left government comes in, undoes that. Then we've suddenly got an issue that can be in the press. We can say, hey, all of a sudden, no platformings have shot up and firings, and the surveys that we've been doing every year are now showing self-censorship's gone up. That's under your government. So now we've got a debate. It's like with the critical race theory in schools issue. That's now a political debate in the U.S. when it wasn't. So, I think this is something where we need to go.
I think it was Abigail Schreier, which I've also had on the podcast too. She wrote an excellent book, Irreversible Damage, about trans kids and treating them from gender dysphoria in a very, very early age. But she wrote about Christopher Rufo, like why people, and he's been organizing parents all over the United States when it comes to these critical race theory, especially in the curriculum and in their children's education, and he's been helping them organize. And many conservatives were very critical of him. And she said, "Yeah, he's winning."
Right.
And I actually think she was right because there's some romanticism on the traditional conservative side of. I love J.R.R. Tolkien, as every listener on this podcast knows, because I always bring him up in every conversation. But he was talking about a long defeat. But of course, he was talking about the from a Christian perspective. But I think the long defeat as a conservative identity has a romanticism. You should be on the losing side, but you're right at least. So when somebody starts winning, then you get nervous because that demands something from you as a conservative. And then there was a recent seminar here in Sweden of the market-friendly think tank, right-wing think tank, Timbro organized, and one of the participants, and they were celebrating a new translation of Edmund Burke's notes on the revolution. But he said that, basically a conservative's role is to just say no and sit back and not participate in the change. And I mean, sometimes, yes, perhaps. But I think that's a cop-out. And maybe then I'm not a conservative at all, if that's the case, because my if you look at personalities, a conservative personality is somebody who does that. But a conservative, political conservative, I would say that you maybe you should have a more of a proactive stance than that. I hope, because otherwise you will participate and in your own destruction, basically, if you don't do anything about this. Because the people who are populating the big companies, tech companies, they are educated at universities, so that's why we focus a lot of the time on schools and universities, because that's where the people are educated, and they take that education into the firms and into the government agencies, into the government, and then it's too late perhaps to change a whole generation of people.
Well, yeah, because I think the fundamental problem with conservatism, as we've inherited it, is it has been optimized for fighting the Cold War, for fighting the battle between economic socialism and economic liberalism. So government is the enemy. Anything that centralizes power is the enemy, because it'll stifle the free market and economic growth. Well, I mean, we can have a debate over the relative balance of markets versus welfare state. But in a way, those questions, I think, are much more second order and secondary now. You know, those problems are largely going to take care of themselves, in the sense that people want nice government services. They want low taxes. The markets don't want you to run a big deficit. You don't have much room to move. The much more interesting question in terms of defining who you are culturally, conservative or on the left, is cultural now. And so we've got to move away from the kind of economic Cold War mentality to what I would call a cultural Cold War mentality, where we've got a new set of philosophies vying for control: cultural socialism and cultural liberalism. Cultural socialism is about equal outcomes for identity groups and prevention of emotional harm, i.e. being offended. to even the most sensitive member of a historically disadvantaged identity group. That is what cultural socialism is, and it is taking over our institutions. Now, the question is whether the right wants to sit back and allow itself to be conquered and told what to do, or do they want to fight back? And ultimately, I think they have to fight back. And the only way it can be done is through government now, and now, of course, it can also happen online. Online is a major site of resistance. We know that. But in these areas where there's not a free market, like universities and schools, or hospitals or other institutions, the only way to reform them is through a government-led conservatism. And so I think slowly the penny is dropping, that the old libertarian right, they're starting to realize all they're doing is being useful idiots again for this utter defeat, and that, that they are going to have to move. And actually what you see is people like Rufo and Ron DeSantis, who Rufo has advised, they don't have necessarily an intellectual guiding philosophy. They just are reacting and doing things that work, and almost in that sort of pragmatic, practical way. But in so doing, I think they are defining a new philosophy, which I would call a kind of reformist rather than libertarian conservatism. And I'd say the same on the schools issue, by the way. Opting out of schools and universities to set up your own, I mean, that's great, but I think that is no solution, because the number of people who do that is small, number one. School choice is great, but actually the reality is most people choose schools on the basis of how good they are in getting their kid into the top university. They don't care necessarily about whether they're being indoctrinated or not. So the only real way you get at this is through government and legislation and regulation. So in the UK case, schools aren't allowed to indoctrinate, but that's not being enforced. So you need to set up a bureaucracy that can actually execute the law and prevent schools from indoctrinating, which means you have to be very detailed. You can't say, anti-racism is a consensus value, but Black Lives Matter is not a consensus, so you can't say get everybody to cheer for Black Lives Matter, but you can. The problem is if you say anti-racism is a consensus value and you don't define racism, then if somebody says Ibram X. Kendi and systemic, the whole critical race theory is part of anti-racism, therefore it's consensus and it's not political. In fact, if you were as a government to say this is actually political, it's not moral, you can't teach it as fact, then you will shut it down very effectively. So that's what we need to be doing, is getting into that level of detail, and it's got to be government-led.
Thank you very much, Eric Kaufman, for being part of Rak Höger.
Thanks, Ivar. Thanks very much.
Och stort tack till dig som har lyssnat. Gå gärna in och skriv en recension på Apple Podcasts eller i den app där du lyssnar på podden. Och detta är alltså en del av en större publikation på Substack med samma namn som podden. Och den som prenumererar där kan även ta del av de texter jag skriver. Gillar man det man läser och hör får man gärna bli betalande prenumerant för 5 euro i månaden eller 50 om året. Då får man ta del av lite exklusivt extra material också. Du hittar rubbet på ivararpi.se. Och har du några frågor eller synpunkter kan du alltid mejla mig på ivararpi@substack.com. Vi hörs igen.